Hello, this is Professor Broker, and this is your Chapter 6, Lecture 2, Government Policy, Part 2 for Econ 231. Let's go ahead and get started. So remember, we were talking about government interventions into a market economy. We said that they can intervene with price controls if they think the price is unfair, either too low or too high. The price controls come in two flavors. They come in the case of price ceilings, which are legal maximums. They also can take the flavor of a price floor, which is a legal minimum designed to help producers in the economy or in the market. Then there's also taxes. Okay, and again, we're using our supply and demand framework and model to help us understand how these policies create both winners and losers in the situation and ultimately distorts the market in some way. Okay, so to look at price floors in this case, let's look at the market for milk. So we have the price of milk on the y-axis, the quantity of milk. On the x-axis, we have a downward sloping demand curve for milk. We have an upward sloping supply curve for milk. Let's say equilibrium for a gallon of milk right now. Equilibrium price is $3 a gallon. There's 500 gallons bought and sold on any given day. Okay, so how would a price floor potentially affect market outcomes? Well, imagine a price floor, which is a legal minimum in this market, right, of $1 being instituted. The government says we want to help out milk farmers. We want to make sure that they are at least getting $1 per gallon for their milk. Okay? Well, how would that impact the market? I mean, people are going to look around and say, you know, we're already getting at least $1. In fact, producers are getting how much? Buyers are willing to pay $3. So of course they're getting at least $1, right? This price floor below equilibrium will not be binding. It's not going to have any effect on the market outcome because the market equilibrium is already above the legal minimum. Okay? Now, maybe the government realizes this, and so they, in an attempt to help out producers, they institute an even higher price floor, this time $4. They want to make sure that milk producers get at least $4 per gallon of milk. Now, would this affect the market? Of course it would, because the original equilibrium, $3, is now illegal. It's not high enough. Okay? And so this would create some sort of binding distortion in the market. Okay. Now think about what would happen, right? Again, just like we did with the price ceiling and how it distorted the market, what does higher prices do? Well, the law of demand says that higher prices would decrease the quantity demanded of milk, right? Say from the equilibrium quantity of 500 back down to only 400. So people would want less milk at the higher price. Okay, but suppliers would be more than willing to supply more, right? Quantity supplied of milk would actually increase at the higher price because of the law of supply. Okay. Now, this obviously would create some distortion, right? A binding distortion in the market called a surplus, right? This would be where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and of course, this surplus would exist as long as the binding price floor existed, because the natural market mechanism to eliminate this surplus would be the price falling. However, with this government control in the place, the price can't fall to eliminate the surplus. Now, we might ask the question, okay, well, it creates a distortion in the market. Does that mean that it's totally bad? Well, it's not totally bad. There are winners in this case. Who would be the winners? Well, clearly, there are 400 people who are able to buy, who are still willing to buy and are able to buy gallons of milk. There's 400 gallons of milk, I should say, that are bought and sold at the higher price of $4. So the sellers that are able to get rid of their milk at the new higher price, okay, these 400 gallons, they would be better off, the sellers that are able to sell their milk to these buyers. However, there would be these 150 gallons, right, that would not be sold. So if you're one of the sellers who happens to draw the short straw, and you're not able to sell your milk, you clearly are worse off than you were before, because before, even at the lower price, you were at least able to sell your milk, but now you're not even able to sell it for anything. Okay, and so those 150 gallons, the producers of those 150 gallons would be worse off. Who else is worse off? Well, clearly, how about the buyers? Who's paying more for milk at the grocery store? Consumers are, right? So who benefits? The sellers able to still sell their product at the higher price. Who loses? Consumers through higher prices, which is the same thing as saying lower real incomes, and the sellers unable to get rid of their product. Okay, so there are winners and losers. Now, and this does happen in the real world, and what can the government do with the surplus? So say there's a surplus of cheese or a surplus of milk. Well, the government can then buy up that surplus, making the sellers better off. And then, of course, the government has the product, and they can redistribute to maybe food programs and so on. And so you might think, see, if the government does that, then there's no losers. Well, not really, right? I mean, how does the government pay to buy that surplus? Well, obviously they pay with that through tax revenue. So everything else equal, you would expect higher taxes to be able to buy up that surplus, or redirected spending from some programs towards buying up this surplus. So either way, somebody is worse off as a result of this distortion. Okay. Now, some people have a hard time remembering when is a price floor binding, when is it not binding. Again, remember that you're this person, okay, with the equilibrium at your torso getting off an elevator. Okay, there's two situations. A floor, you getting off the elevator, and the floor could be at your feet, okay, or a floor could be at your shoulders. Clearly, which one would put you in a bind, quote unquote? Which one would cause a problem? Of course, if the floor is at your shoulders, you're in between floors, that clearly would create a problem. Okay, well, that's when a price floor in our market is binding, is when it's above equilibrium. Just like it would be a problem if you got off the elevator and the floor was above you, it's also a problem in our market when the floor is above equilibrium. That's when it creates the distortion or the surplus. Here's a question. In this question, in panel B, would there be a shortage of wheat? Okay, panel B. Notice we've got a price floor above equilibrium. Would that create a shortage? Well, not really, right? Because, again, this is a price floor, okay? And so, again, remember, it's price ceilings when they're binding that create shortages, okay? And I would just think about this situation logically. Here we have a legal minimum. Okay, and so the price can't go below it, okay? And so what's it going to create? Well, it's going to have quantity supplied over here, okay? It's going to have quantity demanded over here, okay? So which one's bigger? Well, the supply. Well, when supply is bigger than demand, what would we call this? That we would call this a surplus, right? So again, this is a price floor above equilibrium. It would be binding, and it would create a surplus. Which answer says that? The only answer that says that would be C. Right? Shortage would be a ceiling. Equilibrium would be if this was not binding, but that's not true. This is binding because it's a price floor above equilibrium. So B wouldn't be correct. C would be correct. Let's look at D. Lines of people waiting to buy wheat. When would that happen? That would happen in a shortage, which is the same as answer A. So both of those are incorrect. The only answer that makes sense is answer C. Now, you can't leave talking about price floors without talking about probably the most famous price floor, which is the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a price floor, a legal minimum in the labor market. Okay? And, of course, this is controversial, and there's economists of all stripes that have different varying views on whether the minimum wage should be raised or lowered or anything like that. We're not going to really, my intentions are not to get into the political discussion of this, but just to use our model to help us understand what potential distortions could exist through a binding minimum wage and how that might impact the market. And again, of course, there's going to be winners, there's going to be losers, there's going to be a trade-off involved. And so it's not saying that we should do this or shouldn't do this or anything like that. Okay? But let's just assume, again, let's talk about our labor market. Okay? The price in our labor market is going to be our wage, right? That's going to be our y-axis. Our x-axis will be the quantity of labor. Now, who supplies labor, right? The suppliers of labor are actually workers, right? And the demand for labor is employers, okay? Now, obviously, the minimum wage would be most applicable in the low-skilled labor market. We're not talking about the market for doctors and nurses and lawyers and teachers and things like that. That we would classify those as skilled labor, right? And the minimum wage usually isn't relevant in those cases. So when is it relevant? It's relevant in relatively unskilled labor. Okay, so let's just say we start out in equilibrium. The current minimum, let's just assume the current minimum wage, federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour is, let's just say that that's current equilibrium. Okay, so the proposed maybe increase of the minimum wage to say $10.10, right? This would of course be a legal minimum, right? Would this, as a price floor, be binding on the market? Well, of course it would. It's a price floor above equilibrium. How would it be binding? What kind of distortion could it create? Well, it would definitely increase the quantity supplied in the market. In other words, some people might say, well, gosh, at 725, I'm not really willing to work so many hours, or maybe I'm not willing to work at all. Maybe I'm in high school and, I'm not willing to go, work in the evenings or on the weekends for 725 an hour. But at 1010 an hour, well, sure, sign me up, right? That wouldn't be a bad gig. And so we would expect an increase in quantity supplied, maybe something to like Q2. But that's not the only side of the market. What else would happen? We would anticipate, to the degree that the demand curve has some elasticity, it's not perfectly inelastic, we would expect there to be some reduction in quantity demanded, right? I can think of a situation when I was in high school at my first job, when the minimum wage was rising from $5.15 to $7.25. That first jumped. It was $5.15 at the time. I can remember very vividly and candidly the manager at my place of employment was talking and saying exactly that as soon as it raised from $5.15 to $7.25, he was going to have to let go some of our workers. Again, that would be this reduction, right, from equilibrium to a decrease in quantity demanded. Now, to the degree that that happens, of course, what would that create? Well, it would create a surplus of workers, right? Just there would be some amount of quantity supplied that we would anticipate would be greater than quantity demanded. What would that create? A surplus of workers. We might even call that some level of unemployment. Now, there's some debate as to how much quote-unquote unemployment in the relatively unskilled labor market would be created, but we would expect maybe our model would predict some level of that unemployment. Now, can you identify, though, who would be better off from this? Of course you can. There would be some workers represented right here, okay, by Q1 that would still be employed, that would be earning the higher wage. They would probably be the relatively more skilled workers in this particularly low skilled labor environment, and maybe the ones with the most experience and so on, and they would clearly be better off. They would be making more money. There's no doubt about it. And so, the degree to which this number is still a substantial number, and, in terms of workers still, retaining their minimum wage jobs, that would be a huge benefit to them and potentially to the economy. Now, who would be potentially worse off from this particular situation if it's true, right? If it's a binding situation and if it creates a surplus of workers, well, there's two groups that would be worse off. One, the employers who are paying the higher minimum wage would clearly be worse off. They would clearly have less money available for other things, hiring new workers, maybe investments and things like that they would have to recoup either through potentially slowing hiring or through raising their prices. I mean, that would have to happen, right, in order for them to be whole, or they would simply be worse off. The other group that would be worse off would be any potential laborer who wants to work at the higher minimum wage that now can't find a job, right? And that group would, of course, be represented by this unemployment in this sector, this surplus of workers. Okay? Now, there's a couple different camps. There are economists that, basically will accept this basic analysis, but are still in favor of raising the minimum wage. And let me give you some of their best arguments, right? So they would argue that increasing the minimum wage decreases employee turnover. There's evidence of this, right? That as you raise the minimum wage, workers at these jobs have higher morale, and therefore they stick around longer. Employers with high turnover rates, with workers coming in, being hired, and quitting at a very fast rate, that's very expensive for an employer. And so workers sticking around longer is actually a level of cost savings for the employer. So that's actually a good thing, and raising the minimum wage can actually help with that. Raising the minimum wage can increase productivity, and so you tend to retain the most productive workers as you raise the minimum wage. If you have to slow hiring, or if you have to maybe let some people go, you're probably going to let go your least productive workers and keep your most productive workers. Also, these workers, they're paid more, higher morale, they tend to increase their productivity, so that's a good thing. They also argue, those in favor of raising the minimum wage, that the negative employment effects might not be that large and might even be non-existent. And so how could that be? Well, let's think about elasticity, right? I mean, if this demand curve is fairly inelastic, and if this supply curve is much more inelastic, which means both curves would be more vertical, you could imagine a situation where this surplus of workers is actually very small. And that's, of course, entirely possible. And then, of course, they would argue that labor markets aren't necessarily competitive as this model assumes. This model assumes essentially perfect competition. They would argue that employers definitely have more bargaining power than workers. In these situations, the market's not perfectly competitive. Therefore, the government has every justification to step in and with this policy, even if it does potentially create some distortion. That would be some economist arguments in favor of raising the minimum wage. Okay, perfectly valid. There's other arguments, other economists that are a little bit more skeptical. It's not that they don't want to help workers; it's just that they're a little bit more skeptical of both the benefits and of the minimum costs of raising the minimum wage. They would argue that increasing the minimum wage does create some unemployment, especially among the least skilled workers. There's ample evidence of this. Most recently in Seattle, there's been reports that they raised the minimum wage within the city of Seattle to $15 an hour on a graduated basis, and just about 1 year into that process, Seattle's already seen an extreme drop in restaurant and hospitality employment in their city, even as hospitality and restaurant employment is booming in other parts of the state of Washington. And there's ample other evidence that suggests that this gap, this surplus of workers, really does exist when you have a binding price floor in the minimum wage market. It also can cause price hikes. There's evidence of this, that employers that are forced to raise the minimum wage for their workers, they might let go of some workers. They also might increase their prices of things, and of course that would tend to most disproportionately impact the poor in America. The middle class and the upper middle class and the rich can of course afford higher prices, whereas the poor Americans, those earning the minimum wage, would be the least able to absorb higher prices. They would also point out that raising the minimum wage is actually, of course, the minimum wage in context is usually talked about in terms of poor families and helping poor families, get by and things like that, which of course is laudable. However, critics would point out that raising the minimum wage is actually, it's not very effective at targeting the poor. One Congressional Budget Office estimate estimates that only 19% of the beneficiaries of raising the minimum wage would actually be poor families. Actually, almost a third, more, after taxes, 28% of the increased earnings go to families in the top 40% of the income distribution. Well, who in the heck is that? I mean, even after taxes, if a good chunk of the people who get the minimum wage benefit go to families in this top income echelon, what is that representing, right? That's because a lot of the people who earn minimum wage are actually teenagers and young adults from middle class and upper middle class families. And so, again, raising the minimum wage probably would help some poor families. It would also help out tremendously middle class and upper middle class teenagers, which maybe we should do, but that's not typically talked about when raising the minimum wage, because they may or may not be the ones that people think are the most deserving, right? Obviously poor families would be deserving, and then there might be more of a debate on the middle class or upper middle class teenagers. Economists are deeply divided on whether this is a good idea in terms of raising the minimum wage, right? However, most economists would concede our basic analysis that essentially it's a trade-off. Some people would be better off. There would be other people that would be worse off. And, it's going to fall along the lines of, who do you side more with, right? Do you side more with the beneficiaries? Do you side more with the people who would be worse off? That's basically what your decision is going to come down to. Nearly all economists agree that there is actually a much better way at helping the working poor compared to the minimum wage, and that is through the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is essentially a subsidy on work. I don't have time to get into it, but essentially it subsidizes work at a graduated pace. Therefore, you don't get the disincentives in terms of employees not hiring workers at the low end. You also don't get the disincentive of work. It actually encourages more work at the low end, as well as you can very specifically target poor working families through the tax code, which the minimum wage is not very effective at doing. So there's the minimum wage for you. It is a very famous or infamous example of a price floor. Okay, so again, evaluating price controls. Markets, we said in chapter 1, are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Prices serve as the signals in a market economy, and when the government steps in to try to alter those prices, they distort the signals and can therefore cause pretty significant distortions oftentimes in the marketplaces. Price controls are often intended to help poor people and other groups, but most economists would say that often these price controls can often hurt the poor